Yes, Nimbula Vinaka, Vinaka vakalevu na nomini semati kumai and kai Vinaka nikua, Vinaka vakalevu na nomini rongoda na kadi malamalumu muni sema mai and kai Vinaka nikua. Warm greetings to everyone logging in from different parts of the world. Bula Vinaka, aloha, talofalava, malolele, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. Vinaka vakalevu na no muni rongoda na kali malumulu mongo muni ngole mai menda me vitala noa and me VOC and nungi batabatango ni tala noa with Dr. T. Unitaka ni rongo vinaka chukayana bio libo ni program mongo mi Hawaii ni koi singa lotu levu tiko ne karosanga buli singa ni bula o January bula nunga levu ni ambakiro nondolu rosanga bulu karua and bono mai viti bakatalanga kini mai Australia bikitongo i Amerika se singa buke lulutiko ngoni katini kaviuni singa ni bulo January ketomuri chuko nandona singa ia kani marau ni rauni nda mai ndabe batani kua nda mai vitala noa baka osivi na vika senga yado uchinga ngwa na singa baruai mai tonga matini singa na kena kadambote na uli ni bono kama sena tabua kena dana baka viti makau sena volcano na kena dana baka Britania baka telenga kina na uoloka ngai lako taraba mai ninda kila na uoloka batikina une kena kadambote ni uli pulo era biwe kanitu era sema batatu kila na tikini ngono goe kambimbi menda numira na wekanda mitonga dana numira na masu dana numira na non-dependent numi baka biwe kani tiku talanga mitongo ira sona wekanda itoke kila dana numira tiku na ngono go na buku ni nrenre era lako doromatiko unitaka ni dana vito ko ni bata non ratoko ni na wekanda mitonga senga walanga ni madongo na mabula katumai vital na lomani bula satu ngai matanda balete ni ndotoka na daka baitamer na kena baka binakataki na beka rostabati ko na wekanda mitonga ona bosa matango baka Britania mo baka mbula bir keda na wekandera second klana bosa baka okay. Warm greetings again to our visitors and friends who've joined this very special session with our guest Professor Paddy Nunn, who's logging in from the University of Sunshine Coast in Australia. So I just wanted to acknowledge the events that took place in Tonga last Saturday, and I know that it touched everyone all over the world, and particularly Fiji, because we are the closest neighbor to Tonga, and also we acknowledge that we also have our Itoke and other Fijian families who are also living in Tonga. And for all our Tongan friends and family that are watching, our thoughts are with you, and we're thinking of you all at this time. And we know that it's not an easy time that you're all going through right now, particularly with the media or just the communication that is not available to the Kingdom of Tonga for the technical reasons that we all know. But I thought that this week was a wonderful opportunity to talk to different individuals who can come in and share some of their knowledge and understanding of the region. It's much bigger than Tonga, much bigger than Fiji. It's something that we can all empower ourselves with in terms of understanding and appreciating our environment, what is on the surface of the earth and what is below the sea. And we are blessed that we have scientists, that we have geographers and geologists and seismologists and volcanologists and so many other people in this field that specialize in those areas of work, that they can be able to help us be more informed with the places that we call home. And so at this moment, I would like to acknowledge and welcome Professor Paddy Nunn one more time to my program. He's been on my program a few times, and we're all very, very appreciative of all the talanoa and the sharing that he has willingly given for us to share together as a family, to share together as a people of the Moana, or the people of Te Moana Nui Akiwa. So mule Vinaka once more, Professor Paddy Nunn, Vinaka vakalevu for coming to my program, and welcome again. And what's the weather like in Australia at the moment, Paddy?
Oh, it's very stormy here in Australia at the moment. But could I just say Mura Vinaka to everyone, Malombula to everyone in Laos, and Maloelele to everyone in Tonga. We're all thinking of you wherever we are in the world, and our hearts and our prayers go out to you with great sincerity at the moment. And I'd also like to have a special shout out to Losalini and Salai, who I know who are listening in tonight. Get vaccinated, Lewa. Okay.
Paddy for willing to be here once more and just to share some more information in terms of your research over the years, and also not only just the research but the many publications that you have written in the subject of underwater volcanoes and tsunami and other natural occurrences that happens around the region. And also many of your students are listening in from the University of the South Pacific. I can see Master Le connecting in from Japan. Konnichiwa, Master Le. And to all of Professor Paddy Nunn students from USP, welcome once more to the program. And Professor Paddy, in terms of your research, I know you've done majority of the work, I think in many parts of the Pacific. Would you like just to share a little bit to the audience in terms of the research that you've done and the places that you've been to?
Okay, I'm going to speak mostly in English tonight because I know there's quite a multinational audience out there. So my background is as a geologist, and I've spent 25 years at the University of the South Pacific. And I think one of the things that taught me is that the Western scientific lens through which we explain natural phenomena is not the only lens that you can use to explain these. And I will elaborate on this later on in this evening's talk with Dr. Tarisi, especially around the stories about Maui. But just for now, I think it's very important to understand that the Pacific Islands are located obviously in the Pacific Ocean, which is about 1/3 of the total surface area of the Earth. It's absolutely enormous. And it really wasn't until about 40 or 50 years ago that we started to understand a lot about the geology and the geological evolution of the Pacific Basin. So we are still learning an awful lot about things like the volcanic eruptions that took place in Tonga. But basically, in many parts of the Pacific, we get volcanoes erupting, sometimes above the surface of the ocean, sometimes below the surface of the ocean. It doesn't really matter. There's a mixture of both. So here is the Pacific Ocean. So roughly about a third of the Earth's surface. And you can see the Tonga Trench there. Just hold this slide, Tarisi. So what is happening is that on the right-hand side of the Tonga Trench, as you're looking at it, so to the east, you've got this massive chunk of the Earth's crust called the Pacific Plate, which is moving slowly towards the northwest at about 9, 10, sometimes 11 centimeters every year. So it's a very, very slow movement, but it's still moving. And what happens on the other side of the Tonga Trench is that you have another chunk of the Earth's crust that is resisting. So you see it perfectly in this map here. You see the Pacific Plate that's moving towards the northwest, the Australian Indian Plate, which is moving largely towards the northeast. And where the two collide at the Tonga Trench, what happens is that they start off by pushing against each other like this, push, push, push. The pressure builds up and eventually one of them slips down underneath the other. And what's happening at the Tonga Trench is that the Pacific Plate is being pushed down underneath the Australian Plate, which is rising up. And when the Pacific Plate gets down to about here, where my fingers are, it melts and the liquid rock rises up to the Earth's surface and comes out as volcanoes. So it's a very simple system to understand. You've got this great chunk of Earth's crust or lithosphere that's being pushed down into the Earth, being forced down into the Earth where it's really, really, really hot. And when it gets down to a certain depth, the rock melts and the liquid rock then rises up through the Australian Plate and comes out wherever it can at the surface. And that means, of course, it means the ocean floor. Sometimes it builds a volcano up on the ocean floor, but it's still below the ocean surface. Sometimes it builds a volcano up really high, and it rises above the ocean surface. And in Tonga, you have examples of both types. So you have high volcanic islands like Tofua, and Tofua in the Pacific is a word that means volcano. In Fijian, it's Tavua or Tofuanga in Lao and Taviuni and Takandrove. So the same word. So Tofua is a high volcanic island in Tonga, and it's well above the ocean surface. It's a magnificent cone that sticks up above the ocean surface. And the people from nearby islands come across and they farm the lowland because the soils are so incredibly fertile, as they are on many volcanic islands. But there are also other volcanoes in Tonga that haven't quite made it above the ocean surface. The summits of those volcanoes lie just beneath the ocean surface. And sometimes when they erupt, as with Hunga Tonga and Hunga Ha'apai, what happens is they blast up above the surface and they actually build an island. And often that island will get washed away when the eruption finishes, but sometimes not. So in Tonga, you've got a whole line of volcanic islands that run above the melting zone of the plate that's going down. And these include Hai Tofua, they include Ata in the south of Tonga, and they include, of course, the Hungas, Hunga Tonga and Hunga Ha'apai. They include Late Iki, and they include Whanua Fo'o, which the British used to call Falcon Island. And they're all on a line there. You can't see it on this map, but that's not really important. They're all on a line there, parallel to the Tonga Trench. And these volcanoes have been erupting ever since the Tonga Trench existed, ever since the Pacific plate started to push down underneath the Australian Indian Ocean plate and melting took place. These volcanoes have been forming. And that's roughly about 42 million years ago. So long before people ever came to the Pacific, there were volcanoes erupting in this part of the Pacific Ocean. And we know that because we understand how long these processes have been going on. So the point that I would make here is that you can't pretend that these kinds of events are new. They have been occurring for millions of years, long before people came to the Pacific. And of course, they didn't stop once people came to the Pacific. But people in the Pacific learned to live with these periodic events. I think, Dr. Teresi, you have a slide of the
Sure.
Tonga Trench, the colored one.
Okay. Yes, I've got it here.
Showing the Lau Ridge and the rest of the islands of Fiji.
Okay. Here you are. There. Oops. Oh, was it the share?
Perfect. So what you can see here is that the Tonga Trench, where the Pacific plate is going down underneath the Indo-Australian plate, actually continues all the way south, the Kermadec Trench, and eventually ends up off the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. And then it actually crosses New Zealand and goes along the western side of the South Island. But that's not really important. So what's important is that the Tonga volcanoes are matched by volcanoes in the Kermadec Islands, and they are matched by volcanoes that occur off the coast of New Zealand. And many people who've been to New Zealand will have heard of Taupo and Mount Ruapehu and all the other active volcanoes that are down the central spine of the North Island of New Zealand. These volcanoes erupt today for exactly the same reasons as Hangatonga and Hangaha'apai have just erupted. It's the same process that's going on. But I want to draw your attention to one really interesting thing, which fascinated me when I first came to Fiji more than 100 years ago. That's a joke. It's the Lau Ridge. So you can see parallel to the Kermadec Arc, there's the Colville Ridge. And coming up, there's the Lau Ridge, from which the Lau Islands rise. The Lau Islands from Onui Lau in the south up to Vakalevu and Canadair and places like that in the north. And then they run, of course, into the rest of Fiji. Now, what happened about 40 million years ago was that the Lau Ridge was actually where the Tonga Ridge is today. And it was a line of active volcanoes. And then gradually what happened was between the Lau Ridge and the Tonga Ridge, the seafloor started to spread apart like this, separating the Tonga and the Lau ridges. So the Tonga Ridge stayed in the east, a line of active volcanoes, and the Lau Ridge went off to the west. And when you go to the Lau Islands today, you see most of them are high limestone islands. But underneath that limestone cover, there is volcanic rock. And those are the old volcanoes there that were once along the Tonga Trench. They sunk, they became covered with coral reef, and then they got pushed up again. So now what you see is the dead coral reef sitting on top of the old volcanoes in Lau. So again, what I'm trying to do here is to show how this part of the Pacific has evolved over a very, very long period of time. Sorry, Teresi, I'm talking too much.
Lenga, totoka saranga, ravambulun bulu Vinaka final tivaga, ela, wanga di vavalangi yo. Most also Vinaka saranga mo talanoa Paddy, go for it.
Okay, so so that's the situation there. And the main islands of Fiji are a little bit different. As you can almost see on this map, the main islands of Fiji, they've actually been rotated anti-clockwise like this. So the Asawas and the Mamanudas in the west actually mark or trace the line where this island platform has been twisted around like that. And then you've got this really strange island in the south called Kondavu, you know, where Dr. Tarisi comes from Kondavu, so I always tease her about this. But yes, Kondavu is a very young island compared to the rest of Fiji, along with Taveuni. And maybe I'll talk about them a little bit later.
Don't Vinaka.
So,
Vinaka.
Dr. Tarisi, the last thing I wanted to say about the underwater volcanoes is they occur all the way along the Tongan Islands, but they also occur in other places for the same reason in the Pacific. So in Vanuatu, and we don't have a map of this, but in Vanuatu, the situation is reversed. You've got the Australian Indian Ocean plate going down underneath, actually it's a smaller Fiji plate, but underneath the plate in the east. And when this plate goes down, it melts down here, and you get a line of volcanoes like that. And they include all the active volcanoes in the center of Vanuatu, the Banks Islands and Kauai and Aoba, places like that, Ambai, which has been in eruption recently. And then if you move even further to the west, to Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea,
Would you like me to share the other map?
No, it's okay. I think it's okay. When you get to Solomons and Papua New Guinea, again, you have active volcanoes there for the same reason. And some of those volcanoes the tops are underwater, they're under the ocean surface. Some of them are above the ocean surface. There's a very famous undersea volcano in Solomon Islands near the island of Gatoke called Kavachi, and people who live on Gatoke Island sometimes see Kavachi erupting. It's about 20 kilometers or so offshore, and it never builds an island, or at least not an island that lasts very long. But when it erupts, the top of the volcano is so close to the ocean surface that you can see it erupting above the ocean surface like that. And there are similar kinds of volcanoes in Papua New Guinea, which form for the same reasons. So it's all about what I call plate convergence. Two plates or chunks of the Earth's crust coming together, one being forced down, the other being forced up. And the one that goes down melts because it's so hot, and then the liquid rock rises to the surface, and you get a line of volcanoes forming like that.
Sesandin. Totok saranga namo namo vamadala pedi, because I think many of us in this current generation, we are just, when we were born, we saw our island. There we saw our island. I saw Kondavu and all the ones in Lawe. They saw Matupu and Kambara, and we are familiar with the islands that are above the sea. So I really appreciate your talano today. You're making us appreciate that there are other things that happened long, long before we came to be alive today, even our ancestors before us, but also to understand what is below the ocean. So fascinating as to what you were, just sharing now.
And I think what you've just said is so important, because I think a lot of planners only look at what's above the ocean surface. And let me give you a really good example, because I know most people listening are from Fiji. So in 1959, there was a big tsunami, a big wave that smashed into the village of Nambukulevo at the western end of the island of Kondavu, the main island of Kondavu. And that tsunami swept across the village. It smashed all the houses. Now, fortunately, everyone in the village, except for 2 or 3 people, had gone to a wedding on Vitilevu. So the village was almost empty. So there were very few deaths as a result of that tsunami. But the point here is that the best explanation that we have for that tsunami is that there was a landslide beneath the ocean surface. So if you look at a high volcanic island like Pandavu, it's like this, and the ocean surface might be here. There might be only a small part of the island above the ocean surface, but there's so much of it below the ocean surface. And sometimes when there's an earthquake, then you get big landslides on the undersea flanks of these volcanoes that causes tsunamis to occur and wash across the land. And there's not much that we can do to prepare for that. Although one of the things we can do is to listen to our histories and to listen to our oral traditions. And I think that modern science tends to ignore traditions, particularly oral traditions in the Pacific. But we know that these stories, these oral traditions, can in some cases go back thousands of years, as we've talked about on this program before. And I think that kind of information is sometimes very helpful to understanding the risk exposure of particular places. There have been tsunamis in the islands of Tonga before. Now people, quickly forget about these things, not just in Tonga, but everywhere in the world. But they have occurred there before. So it would be quite reasonable for people to understand what happens before a tsunami hits, what people can do, and so on and so on. And in some parts of the Pacific, in Solomons, for example, in Vanuatu, the stories are so strong. Wonderful. The stories are so strong in some of these places that people know as soon as they feel an earthquake, they have to run to the hills. As soon as these things happen, they have to get away from the coast because they know a tsunami is likely to occur. And I think that kind of traditional knowledge is should be a very important part of, understanding risk in coastal areas of the Pacific Islands. So you've got a picture up here showing volcanoes and tsunamis. A tsunami is obviously, it's a Japanese word that we use for any kind of large wave that is caused by the abrupt displacement of ocean water. So down here on the seafloor, like I was talking about Nambukulevo in Pandavu, if there is a landslide under the ocean on the sides of this volcano, a huge amount of material suddenly washes into deep water. It displaces water that rises up and smashes back across the land. And it's the same thing with the examples you've got here. When there is a volcanic eruption under the water, under the ocean surface, it moves the water out of the way really quickly. And that's a tsunami that washes up over neighboring coasts. And where Dr. Tarisi is in Hawaii, she probably feels very safe, but it's probably one of the more dangerous places in the Pacific in terms of tsunamis, because all the islands of Hawaii are very, very steep-sided volcanic islands. And sometimes they slip simply because they're so steep. They slip. And when that happens, you do get a locally generated tsunami coming back across the coast. And again, the historical records from places like Hawaii can help us understand when tsunamis are likely, and so on. And of course, the other reason that Dr. Tarisi should sometimes be worried living in Hawaii is because there is a massive underwater volcano named Loihi, just to the east of the big island of Hawaii. Loihi. And Loihi is the new big island. It's underwater at the moment, but it's growing, and eventually it will grow to be the same size as the big island of Hawaii. So everywhere people live in the Pacific Islands, there is a threat from giant waves called tsunamis. And of course, the closer you are to the place where the tsunami originates, in general, the higher the tsunami wave when it washes across the land. I know this is not great consolation to people who are living in Tonga and who've just gone through a tsunami. Of course it's not, but what I'm trying to do is to explain why these things occur and also to underline the point that they occur almost everywhere in the Pacific.
So everywhere we go, there are, as you mentioned, there are threats everywhere of different shapes and forms. The other thing too that was brought to my attention to Paddy was, when it comes to tsunami, as you mentioned, in some islands in the Pacific, like the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and of course with Fiji too, when there's an earthquake, now there's more familiarity. And one of our listeners was just talking about here, Finau Tibanga was just saying that, I think, Finau or Melanie Louis, the more reason that we have to be talking about it like this, to bring it to the forefront of our brain and our attention. But one thing that has been brought to my attention is that when there's tsunami announcements, people go down to the beach to take photos or take videos, even though they should know to get away, from those areas as much as possible. So that is also another reason why I was really interested in our Talano today as an awareness for our people to take these things seriously.
I agree. And I think it's fair to say that in the past, Pacific people knew these things. So the example that I mentioned briefly from Vanuatu was a very interesting one. And it's work that I was involved in. In 1999, at the southern end of Pentecost Island in Vanuatu and Bay Martelli, there was a massive tsunami that washed into the bay and washed right across the coastal flat where there were 2 or 3 villages. Now, the people there had stories that they passed down from one generation to the next, stories that said, whenever the ground shakes, don't stay on the coast, get up into the hills as soon as you can. And that's what they all did in Bay Martelli. They felt the ground shake in 1999, and they all rushed up into the hills. And out of a population of about 250, I think only 3 people were killed as a result of the tsunami impact, because they knew exactly what to do. And those kinds of oral traditions are still very strong in some places. But you're absolutely right. They are not strong in Suva, maybe not even in Nuku'alofa, I'm not sure, or up here, because people have lost touch with their traditional understandings. And, there's no question about it. However good your technology is, you can't warn people within 10 minutes that there's a tsunami coming. If you have undersea monitors that look at wave movements and they detect a tsunami, then the signal has to be relayed, let's say, to Hawaii, which then has to be relayed to Pango, which then has to be relayed to the radio services in Suva or in Port Vila. There's not enough time to effectively warn people using Western technology, which is why the traditional ways of understanding how to respond to tsunamis are so important. And of course, it's absolutely daft when there is a tsunami warning, or you even feel an earthquake, to run down to the sea and look at all the fish stranded as the water is going out. But people do that, not just in the Pacific, they do it all over the world. So I think that's something that we've lost as a result of globalization, that kind of site-specific knowledge about how to best respond when something like this happens.
Vinaka vakalib Sara Paddy for highlighting that, and I understand some of the feedback that are coming through. I think in the case of Tonga, and not only Tonga but many other islands, low-lying islands, what the issues that they have is that there's not enough height or elevation, for them to go to. But I think what you're trying to say is that there are various warning or signals. Even for me, Paddy, I was talking to Saini, our Tongan sister, yesterday, was just kind of like looking at what are the local understanding or the local knowledge about the presence and what was happening just across the harbor from Nuku'alofa, because they knew that there was this island that was formed in 2009. There were eruptions in 2014 and 15, and then it erupted again in 2021, in December 20th. So there has been like a series of eruptions. So in my mind, I was just trying to think, what would be enough warning for us in layman's terms? Because of course, we scientists cannot predict, because that was some of the discussion I've had with some of my friends. How can people be told? Like, I like what you just said earlier, the technology that has those monitors that can help inform people through the radio, through texts, through the sirens, which has been activated in many parts of the Pacific. But what was interesting for me with Hunga Hapai and Hunga Tonga was that there has been some series of eruptions, but just in my mind was how much awareness, I think, in my mind, is just to let people know, or just that awareness. Would you like to say something to that effect, Paddy? Those were just some of my personal observations here.
I've got a nice picture with 4 photographs on.
Okay.
If we could put that up.
Sure.
So if I was the Minister for Education in Tonga, I would make sure that information about the frequency and the incidence of volcanic eruptions in Tonga was part of the curriculum, and that every Tongan school child understood about the places that they live. And in a way, Tarisi, it's not just a Tongan problem, it's the same everywhere in the Pacific Islands, is that we privilege systems of learning that are global. We don't privilege local knowledge. So, as you know very well, a child can go through the Fiji school system, learning more about the geography of South America or the geography of New Zealand than they do about the geography of Fiji. And I think that's really, really sad. And it's one of the things that we always used to do in geography at USP, was to try and introduce Pacific Islands geography from day one. Did you find that slide? Not to worry. It's the one with the 4 photographs on.
Okay.
Sandanalenga.
Okay. Okay. Okay, is that the one with a map with the?
No, there's no map. It's 4 photographs. No, don't worry.
Oh yeah, chingo. Wasat ya. Bula everybody. Vinaka vakalevu for joining in. Paddy, Master Le from Japan. He said if you're going to give him an A+ in his geoscience, he'll come back to your class.
Oh, okay.
Vinaka Master Le. Yes, but so good. A lot of the appreciation coming through. Vinaka vakalevu kamina na sema tiko mai tale na nomni sema tiko mai ni kua menda mai bulida batai le Vinaka and information sharing is just so key, and that's exactly the reason why I'm here with Professor Paddy Nunn, merely for information sharing and ways of perhaps improving our sharing of information and improving our knowledge base, because as everyone knows, knowledge is power, and so it's really critical that we all are familiar with what's happening here, my Paddy.
The point that I really want to make is that, yes, information sharing is important, but it has to be the right kind of information. Okay, so what is happening a lot in the Pacific, or what's been happening a lot over the last 30, 40 years, is that, well, let's talk about this first, and then I'll go back to that. Okay, so I just found these pictures. Obviously, one of the two hungas, Hunga Tonga, Hunga Hapai, in January this year, erupting. And then March 2009, the same volcano erupting. A different volcano erupting in July 1995, Lata Iki, also known as Metis Shoal. And then you can go back to 1928, and there's a photograph of Vanuatu, or Falcon Island, erupting. Now, Vanuatu simply means new land, Vanuatu in Fijian. So what you're looking at in all of these examples are islands that have been created as a result of an eruption from a shallow undersea volcano that erupts so much material that it makes an island like that. But generally, once the eruption is over, once it's finished, then the waves just wash that island away. So these islands that you're looking at here are not generally islands that are permanent components of the geography of Tonga. They come and they go, depending on when and where volcanoes erupt. And I think the earliest record we've got probably of Vanuatu erupting, is about 300 or 250 years ago. And we know that these volcanoes erupted before that time as well. But Tarisi, may I just return to my point about knowledge sharing, because I can see it very well, sitting here in Australia. There is an assumption, whether it's about volcanic hazards, whether it's about climate change, whether it's about, I don't know, food security. There is an assumption that Pacific Island people are helpless, that they know nothing, that they can't possibly help themselves. And so they need outside expertise in order to help them help themselves. And that, to me, is completely wrong. As I often tell audiences in Australia, people have been living in the Pacific Islands, like those of Tonga, like those of Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomons, for more than 3,000 years. They haven't survived in these places by accident, by luck. They survived because they developed ways of living in harmony with an environment that sometimes involved volcanoes erupting, sometimes involved tsunamis, sometimes involved droughts or periods of high rainfall. They evolved ways of coping with these kinds of natural phenomena. So when people turn around to me and say, oh, Pacific Island people lack resilience, I say, that's not true. If you just scratch the surface a little bit and thought about these things instead of privileging foreign ways of doing things, you would learn that this is simply not the case. There's a huge amount of culturally grounded resilience in Pacific Island societies. And I think that, ministers of education need to be at the forefront of privileging this. But people in the Pacific also need to recognize that they have this this depth of understanding that is actually superior to outsiders' understanding of these phenomena. I'm not saying the two can't work together, okay, but it's something I'm very, very passionate about. That, you know, the one needs to inform the other, but it's no good starting out and saying, oh, Pacific Islanders have no way of helping themselves and we need to do everything for them. That's simply not true.
Sa Vinaka vakalevsar di na todo ko na kawasiti ko pedi o klanilebu na kandoyadoi na Pasifika. Even we've been hearing not just for Tonga, for many other natural disasters that has happened in the Pacific. Even before foreign help comes, the islanders are out there. Whatever little that they have, they start working together and just, helping one another.
I always remember when Tikopia Island in Solomon Islands was hit by a cyclone about 20 years ago. By the time the relief agencies got out there with their supplies, the people had already replanted their crops. They'd already rebuilt their houses. And the relief agencies were saying, what is it with these people? They've helped themselves. Well, duh. Okay. Duh. Kaya misa kilava Vinaka, but there palang isa sa kilava Vinaka.
Just to add to that, if I recall, I also read a similar article for Vanuatu. I think it was Cyclone Pem. It was one of those that strong cyclone that came around about the mid 2000. I think Dr. Mary Sovic, you can add more info on that. But the point I was trying to say was that they knew that there was a cyclone coming, so they started going to the pits. The pits are Tekabumbuka Nandalo. Nandalo, na uto, whatever root crop that they could find, and which is actually part of that food security. So when the cyclone went, they just opened it up and they were able to access nakakane tikubeira, and even they start sharing the little that they have, the yams and the ndalo and the breadfruit, to the other islands that were suffering. So that is one story that stayed with me, to see the power of indigenous knowledge, and for them knowing there's a cyclone coming, they knew how to prepare.
And also, I think people in the Pacific used to know much better than they do today how to ferment foods and allow them to stay for months and months and months. I always remember, a story here. When I went to the island of Move in the Lau Islands in Fiji, and I remember someone there taking me along the coast, and just out to sea they had this pile of rocks there, and they took the rocks off and they said, "Smell this." And it was the most disgusting thing I had ever smelt in my life. It was like a dead animal or something like that. And I think they called it kosa. But it was basically breadfruit, I think, that they had put in there. The sea covered it every time the tide was high. It was fermenting in there under the influence of seawater. And although it smelt really bad, they said, we can eat this month after month after month after month. It will remain not fresh, but it will remain edible. And this was a way that they had on Move of actually preserving foods to help them out should something like that happen.
And apparently those fermented food are good for you too. It's medicinal and it's healthy. That's what I heard.
That's right.
Yeah, I think Finau Tivanga said it's kota, Kota.
Kota.
Kosa
is something else, eh?
Kosa we have in Pandava, Kota in Lau.
True. So, the other thing I just wanted to mention that your listeners might find of interest is the other Maui stories. So I don't know if you can put the map up on the screen. So there are stories in almost every Pacific Island culture about the demigod Maui. And so a lot of your kids may have seen the Disney movie Moana, and Maui was the big fella in that. He's called by different names in different cultures, but it's the same person. And one of the things that Maui does with his magic fish hook is he goes around the Pacific and he fishes up islands from the bottom of the ocean. Yeah. So the yellow coloring on this map shows the distribution of Maui stories in the Pacific, from Palau in the Northwest Pacific to New Zealand in the South Pacific, across into French Polynesia, and of course, north into Hawaii. And the heartland of Maui stories seems to be Tonga, Vanuatu, Solomons. It's a bit difficult to be sure. But one of the things that Maui does with his fish hook is to fish up islands that are sitting on the bottom of the ocean. And when he brings them up above the ocean surface with his giant fish hook, often the island, like a fish, is writhing and agitating the water. There's a lot of noise, there's booming and all sorts of things like that. And my theory is that these stories are encoded memories of shallow water volcanic eruptions, like we've just seen at Hunga Tonga and Hunga Ha'apai. And this is an etching of Fonuafo'o erupting in the 1870s. And you can see the picture there. It's just like a giant fish. And of course, I tell this to Australian geologists and they all laugh at me and they think I'm a lunatic. But the point here is that how else do you explain the Maui stories? And how else do you explain the distribution of the Maui stories, marked by the yellow on this map, with the distribution of shallow water volcanoes, which have erupted in the last 3,000 years since people got to the Pacific? So people got to Solomons, they saw Gavachi, and that informed the stories of Maui. They got to Vanuatu and they saw Kaurua, that it informed the stories of Maui. They got to Tonga and they saw all these shallow underwater volcanoes erupting like giant fish and sometimes making islands. So they built the stories of Maui around these observations. So to me, the Maui stories that we celebrate today as something essentially Pacific, they are essentially Pacific, but they are in fact at their heart, they are in fact memories of ancient shallow water volcanic eruptions, which shows us, Dr. Tarisi, which shows us that Pacific people in the past were quite capable of observing and explaining these kinds of things, these kinds of natural phenomena that they observed in different places. So I just throw that out there because I think the tendency with the Maui stories, just like myths all over the world, is just to think of them as good stories. But they are more than that. They're good stories with a meaning that can be identified if you read them closely enough.
I really like the word encoded, encoded memories. And I think with many of indigenous communities too, when we look at myths and legends, I think with what you are trying to say to us is for all of us who are listening in, those of us who are from Fiji or any indigenous community, is to go back to some of our own stories and learn from it. Because definitely there are lessons in there that our ancestors put together for our benefit.
Yeah. So what Tarisi is saying is that, a lot of people today, they dismiss these old stories, their grandparents' stories. They say, oh, they're just old tales that they made up. But the point here is, no, in many, many, many cases, these are not just old tales. And since I moved to Australia in 2010, I've been studying Indigenous Australian stories. And some of those recall times when the ocean surface was much lower and the ocean was rising. And some of those we can date fairly precisely to more than 10,000 years ago. So what that means is that in Australia, stories have been passed down from one generation to the next, for more than 10,000 years, maybe 400 generations. And those stories have not lost their meaning. And it's the same thing to me in the Pacific, is that you can go into communities and you can hear stories that have probably been passed down for thousands of years, perhaps just hundreds of years, but nevertheless, they recall events in the past. And as Dr. Tarisi says, it was always the intention that that knowledge would be passed on. But because today we can read and we can write, we tend to dismiss people who can't read and write and say, these people have nothing of value to inform the way that we live. And my argument again is that this is simply not true. It's not true. There was an awful lot of knowledge accumulated in oral societies or pre-literate societies where people couldn't read and write. Just because people couldn't read and write doesn't mean they couldn't gather knowledge in their brains, that they couldn't organize it, that they couldn't encode it in stories, they couldn't represent it in rock painting. They could. I've always been intrigued by the tradition in Vanuatu of sand drawing. The way that people in Vanuatu used to, well, they still do, but used to make designs in the sand of the beaches, and what those designs mean, because many of those designs do in fact have meaning. And I think that it's all over the Pacific. And hopefully enough of this has been documented so that at some stage in the future, someone can come and research all this and actually get to the truth of it.
And I think you've highlighted a really important point for us as Indigenous people ourselves to start valuing our own stories. And this is something I've been finding in my line of work, as you've also mentioned, that we tend to privilege Western ideas or Western stories or even geography. I remember my mom, she was raised in Pandava and she went to school, and the teacher gave them the map of Pandava for them to put their village in, and she couldn't even place her village on the island of Pandava. But she could definitely know the map of England, you know? So that was interesting, Paddy, what you're saying. And so with the stories as well that are recorded, I can see the names of people who are logging in and watching. Most of them are teachers. So this is a challenge out there to those of you listening in. Let's write our own stories. Write it from our Fijian perspective, write it from our New Vanuatu perspective, and let us value and celebrate our stories. Because most of the time, if I can say this, Paddy, for our people, that most of the time we tend to complain when non-islanders come in and write our story. See, there shouldn't be any chance now for any more complaining. We should be here, Kaiviti, Volana, Talanoa. Merisovic and our sisters from Vanuatu, let's write our Talanoa. Because most of the time we give excuses. I don't have time, I don't have time. We have time. So we should put some time aside to start writing our stories and send it to the Ministry of Education, to the Curriculum Development Unit, and put these stories in for the students, our younger Fijians, to learn and hear these stories one more time. So I just thought I'd say that.
Can I say two things?
Go.
The first is Kaliopate Tavola, who I hope is listening in. He has a brilliant website called kaidravuni.com. And on that website, he has recorded a lot of the traditional stories of the people of Kondavu. And I think that, you know, to be honest, the Ministry of Education sometimes isn't the best place to send these things. But if you can find a website, or if you can lodge them in the museum or something like that, And Vanuatu is a great place because it has a person on each island who is charged by the Vanuatu Cultural Center to collect information, artifacts and stories, and to relay them to the cultural center. You know, the other thing, Tarisi, you know, and we may disagree on this, I don't think that simply recording indigenous stories is always enough. I think it's important because they might otherwise be lost. But I think also there needs to be some dialogue with other people. So I would have hated for someone, you know, to have come along and collected all these stories about Maui or something like that and analyzed them and not given me the opportunity to say there's a clear link with volcanic eruptions, shallow water volcanic eruptions across the Pacific. So I wouldn't perhaps express the need quite as rigidly as you do. I think everyone who lives in the Pacific Islands, everyone who's engaged with the Pacific Islands, everyone who is capable of seeing beneath the surface of the Pacific Islands, and sometimes that's very difficult, but you know, everyone there has a contribution to make in this regard, and so I suppose I would just put that appeal out there. Yeah, I mean, it's it's not a big thing. One way or the other, I think we need to do our best to record stories before they're lost, but we also need to give those stories as much meaning as we possibly can, rather than allowing Western science just to sort of trample all over and say, you know, we know better, we know better. Because clearly to me, you know, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, Pacific Island people did know about the distribution of shallow water volcanoes in the Pacific, and they encoded these stories into the stories of Maui. And if a geologist before me had come along and said, this is what these stories mean, we would all have been enlightened far earlier.
And I think another point I want to share too is the power of our language. The new island in Tonga that was formed in 1928. And it can be translated as Vanuatu. So for those of us who are of Fijian descent, we'll know straight away what Vanuatu is, which marked that particular event in which a new island was formed. And I think that's something that I want to highlight as well, the importance of holding on and you know, of our language, because the language is so powerful, where a lot of this interesting history, you know, is encoded and is kept in these words. Because I know I've invited, you know, Professor Polongeretti also to my program, and you know, encouraging and pushing our parents today. Was at tiko wakaviti, beira na lubenda, baleta ni kambimbi, ni chikoiloma levo ni tukutuk Macau. Just to give an example, Paddy, this week, so many of my friends, my dear friends, I can see some of them watching and listening today, asking me, Teresi, what's a Fijian word for volcano? No inbox so I decided to do one nice flyer, and I shared it to everybody and tell them this is a Fijian word, which is the tavua and tavuanga, the one you talked about.
So there's a sorry, carry on.
Go for it.
No. There is a tavua island in Yasawa, I think.
Yeah.
And it looks just like a volcano. It's not a volcano, but it looks like one. So I imagine the first people coming from Vanuatu, they saw this island and they said, oh, Tavua. And they gave it that name. But on Taveuni, one of the young volcanoes in the southwest part of Taveuni, is called Tavuyanga. But then you're going to say, well, and I would say this to Paul Garrity if he was here, you know, why is Tavua town called Tavua? There's no volcano there. And that's an interesting story that sometimes place names don't have meaning where they are. Maybe they've been moved or transported from somewhere else. But I absolutely agree with you. I think language is important, but also place names. And this is something, someone was asking me a couple of years ago when I was on Pandava, and they said, what does Korovo mean? I hear this word all the time. I said, it just means Newtown. And they said, what? You mean like Newtown in Sydney? I said, yeah, just like Newtown in Sydney. I said, there's Korovos all over the place in Fiji. They said, I thought it was something really complicated. I said, yeah, it's not.
And also behind the word Korvo, there would be stories as to why the village was new. Say that, right?
Yeah.
Because I remember, is it in Koreanito, they have a village called Ambava. It has a story because they have to be relocated because of landslide. Yeah. So again, those natural phenomena that happen because of the movement of our people, they move from place to place. So therefore, as they move, they take the name with them, or they recreate the name to remember a certain event. So totoka saranga, place name. Get your notebook and start writing down some of the villages.
But not if you're from Mothe. Mothe, the first koro was Korondua, the second koro was Kororua, the third koro was Korotolu, and now they've got Korova in Suva. So people of Mothe, I think, lack imagination that people in other parts of Fiji have. For those of you, in English, it just means village number 1, village number 2, village number 3, and now they've got village number 4. So very unimaginative people from Mothe.
So I'm sure they're ready for Korolima, Korono. So we are ready for the numbers to go. Yeah.
But Tarisi, I think one thing that's very interesting, going back to the tsunami, is that when you have a shallow water volcanic eruption, what happens is you've got cold ocean water, and then you've got liquid rock coming up, and where the two meet, liquid rock and cold ocean water, there's a massive explosion, and a lot of the rock that's produced in that explosion is very, very not very dense rock called pumice in English, Pumice, soata in Fijian. And these this pumice forms these great mats that stick together, and they float across the ocean. And some of them, have floated all the way from Tonga to Fiji. So most of the pumice or the soata that you find on Fiji's beaches comes from Tonga, comes from shallow water volcanoes in Tonga. So there are some islands in Fiji. There's Nasuata in Rewa, islands that are built almost entirely from Tongan pumice. The last time I was on Vatulele Island in Nandronga, they were complaining because the beaches of the east coast of Vatulele were just covered with this masses of soata, masses of pumice that had come from an underwater volcanic eruption in Tonga. And yeah, what do you do? It's so, everything is interconnected like that.
I remembered in 2006 when we were in Canberra with Dr. Jeff Clark and Mata, Sepeti Mata. Boleh Vinaka Sepeti.
Vinaka Mata.
Yeah, still listening in from Mokosoi in Pacific Harbour. Bambula sarchukani be Sepeti Matararamba turangan ni Lomachi me Matuku. Dombula Vinaka me Matuku. When we were coming back on the Sandy, the boat, ketula ko may ongea. Pedi sa siang ni takarau sa sing toso na wang. Na lebu ni soata. Sa viri na bango, the wiri kere everywhere. So the boat
was just slowly, surrounded by pumice, yeah.
Sa pumice keda nga bakandua. Oh, and the ngoro and sangera tukun chinga mayor to na kay mua. Gorin do na volcano may Tonga gori. Erto tukun chinga ba era da buti Tonga chiko. That's where the sawata came from. Sa andina tatok. Sa nakabakalev sar be kami na barang chiko mai sar lele bundi na pedira babi di nakatiko mengo na be wase tos chuk na tatala ka be wase pedi talno be wase talemai
Na wasea?
iya tatale na talano sia na ka be na katamo wase
I think we could talk about some of the other volcanoes in the Pacific.
Right. Yes.
You know, when I was teaching at USP, most of the students were from Fiji, and I always used to enjoy it when I used to say, "Oh, there's lots of volcanoes in Tonga, there's lots in Vanuatu and Solomons, but there aren't any in Fiji, are there?" And all the Fijians used to go, yeah, none in Fiji. I said, "Oh, you people are wrong, hey? 350 years ago, we had an eruption in Taveuni from Tavuanga, 350 years ago. And if you travel down the southwest part of Taveuni Island, you can see these old volcanic craters. And of course, Kondavu is the big one. So we know that the last eruption in Kondavu was probably about 400 years ago, but the big eruption before that was about 2,500 years ago. And as we've talked about in a previous program, I've had a research student working on Kondavu, collecting stories about the last eruption of Nambukulevo volcano in Kondavu. And she was working with Meli Nanuku from the Fiji Museum, with Jerry Vesa from the Fiji Museum, Torangamai Ono, and of course with Kalipate Tavola and several others as well. And we have now probably got 13 or 14 different versions of the story of the eruption of Nambukulevo volcano in Kondavu 2,500 years ago. We've written it up for publication. It's going to come out later this year in the Harvard University journal called Oral Tradition. And I'm really proud of this study, because it's got a lot of direct quotations from Fijian informants. So in Nambukulevu Ira, we spoke to Ratu Eveli Yalanambai. In Nawaisomo Island, Nawaisomo village on Ono Island, we spoke to Ratu Petero Uluinadeva and got really detailed accounts that had been passed down orally from one generation to the next about what happened during this eruption. So these kinds of stories are out there. But there are other volcanoes that, Nambukulevu will probably erupt again one day. It does shake from time to time. But another volcano to watch, I think, is Yasur on the island of Tana in southern Vanuatu, which seems to be quite an unstable volcano. And if Yasur it's erupting at the moment, but if it was to have a major eruption, that could send tsunamis out, across much of Fiji and across many other parts of the Pacific. So, it's very good that we have an understanding of where potential hazards lie. Can I tell you a story that might entertain your listeners? So if you go from Tonga, if you go east towards the Cook Islands, before you get to the Cook Islands, you come to Niue, Niue. Niue is an island country, and it's really just one island. And I'm very interested in Niue because it's a high limestone island. So going back to the Tonga Trench, as the Tongan crustal plate is going down and as the Australian Indian plate is going up, what's happening here is that this plate is bending upwards like that, and Niue is here. And that's why it's a high limestone island, because it's been pushed up. Wow, you've got Niue there, okay? So it's actually been pushed up on the plate that's trying to get down the Tonga Trench. And it's a high limestone island. It's it's full of cracks and things like that. And the last time I was there, I was waiting at the airport for my flight to Auckland. And this man came and sat next to me. And he said, I'm really worried. I said, oh, hello. Whakalofatu. How do you do? And he said, I'm really worried. He said, I'm the Prime Minister of Niue. And I thought, I don't think so. I think I've got a lunatic here. You know, who comes up to you at an airport and sits down and says to you, I'm the Prime Minister of Niue? But look, he was the Prime Minister of Niue, and my heartfelt apologies. And basically, he was worried because on Niue, at the back of the capital, Alofi, there was a crack in the limestone. And that crack, he said, had been opening up, getting wider and wider since he was a young man. And now he was very worried as to what might happen. And, you know, I'm afraid it's possible that one day that might be the head of a landslide that takes off that part of Niue. But I told him not to worry, because I said, you know, you'll be dead, I'll be dead, you know, our great-great-grandchildren will all be dead by the time this happens, because geological processes operate very, very slowly in the Pacific and everywhere else. And sometimes we tend to get worried because we think, oh, that volcano's erupted. Is there going to be another big eruption next year or something like that? Are we doomed? And I think the point that we all have to understand in the Pacific is that bad things happen, but bad things do not happen very often. And that we can all get on with our lives and we can have fulfilling lives without having to worry too much about these kinds of things. So yes, we should monitor them. We should be aware of them, but we shouldn't lie awake at night worrying about whether or not they're going to happen tomorrow, because the chances are that they're not going to happen tomorrow. And so I think the one point that I really want to make strongly here is that it's very difficult sometimes to get perspective. You know, we think this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. You know, the sky is falling, the world is coming to an end. It's not. It's just that we can't process in our heads, we can't process the vast time range over which these kinds of events sometimes take place.
I'm sitting here when I was listening to you and Vetalanoa with the Prime Minister of Niue. I'm thinking of his ancestors. His great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather. They may have been aware of it during that time, and now it's his time. And as you said, our generation will go and the next one will come and their turn will come. And as I was watching what was happening in Tonga over the weekend and looking at how everyone was reacting to it, I was also thinking of the pictures you were showing, the one that goes back to 1928. So it's kind of like a cycle as we go through and understanding the geology of the world, the geology of this earth and the geology of our region, just so we are a little bit more informed and just adding that knowledge base of what is around us and how can we be prepared for things like this. Even now, we are living in this cyclone timetable. We all know October to April, it's a cyclone season. So we have to be prepared and we have to be ready whenever cyclone comes. But it's interesting again to see of these geological events happening in our region as well. Vinaka vakalevu sar na maybe tanotin ko Professor Paddy bikim ni nawarong chikumai totoko bakawoti na nomuni may bakrarong tiko na program mo. Thank you so much for joining in today. It's just so informative and just so lovely to sit here and listen to Professor Paddy and him simplifying a lot of the scientific concepts that can be very difficult to understand, because yes, the words are very technical, the field is very foreign to many of us, but having Paddy come and talk to us today, he simplifies it in layman's terms so that we can know what is around us. We can, most of us who come from the outer islands, I'm sure after this talanoa with Paddy, we'll be aware when we're on the boat, to be aware of our surroundings. On the reda ng buling-buling niyan. What does Ongen look like? What does Fulanga look like? All those mushroom islands, Paddy, in Fulanga. Now they're on top of the ocean, and they all so all these geological happenings have taken place, for hundreds of years. And for us as human beings, sometimes it's hard to understand and think, okay, most of us live to about 70 to 80 years old. How would we know? But through science and through oral history, all the combining of this knowledge is keeping us informed. There's those mushroom islands, they didn't just arrive on their own. They were part of it. Would you like just to add a little bit more on the island of Fulanga? Not just Fulanga, but lots of other islands with all these mushroom islands, because I know you covered it in one of your books.
I never got to Fulanga, but I got to Nambukulevo, which also has the mushroom islands, just like Fulanga. And basically, what I was saying about the Lau Islands is that they are volcanoes, just like those in Tonga. And after they moved away from the Tonga Trench, they cooled down and they sank, like that. And when they sank below the ocean surface, there's the ocean surface. When they sank down here, they became covered with coral reef. And then for some reason, they got pushed up again. And the coral reef came with the volcano. So what you see today is you see coral reef, which makes limestone, on top of the volcanic islands. And I'm not sure on Namuka, but certainly on islands like Niao in Laos, you can get up there. There's the central plateau, which is limestone covered, the walls of the limestone, the old reef walls, and then underneath where the villages are, you can see the volcanic, the slopes of the old volcano sticking out. So all of the islands in Laos, they are ancient volcanoes that became draped with coral reef that then was lifted up and formed limestone. And look, I'm with you. A lot of this seems very complicated, but the truth is, Tarisi, it's not complicated. And I'm getting increasingly impatient with other professors that I meet who say, well, yeah, it's very complicated. That word complicated or complex, it gets me started. I say, if you can't explain to me in simple terms what you're trying to say, then it's worthless. It's all about communication. And I think that's absolutely true about the Pacific. There's nothing that outsiders have discovered that's not easy to understand. And there's, it should be a two-way process. I think Pacific people have a lot to give to the outside, and the outsiders have some things to give to the Pacific. But it needs to be an equal conversation, okay? Again, I'm getting fed up with, people privileging Western knowledge and Western science and saying, oh, it's so much, better as an explanatory tool compared to indigenous science, wherever it is in the world. Well, that's nonsense, okay? The truth is that people all over the world, before the era of globalization, they survived. And in order to survive, they had to learn about their environment and learn how to manage it, learn how to live there to survive. And that it wasn't just luck. Every group of people was resilient, and globalization has made them less resilient in many ways. And part of the problem is this uncritical privileging of Western or global knowledges, which I think is really unfortunate.
I've got two more slides that two of my, they are kind of like my favorite. But later, I'm looking at a lot of Lawans are logging in now. Bulevinaka Gina, you arrive on Lawan time. We're about to finish our Talanon now. Gina is from Lakemba, Pedi, and apparently she was also your student. But I just thought I'd share these pictures. Baleta ni
Lakemba is one of those islands in Laos where the volcano is sticking out, and it's absolutely wonderful. So Kende Kende in the center of Lakemba is the top of the old volcano, but around the edge, that's where you've got the reef limestone. So Nasangalao, the cave, and places like that. Anyway.
Congo, eh? You know, when I saw this picture, you know, because I'm from Kandavu and I go by boat in the Bondawanga, from Suva to go past Benga to Kandavu, and we know that in the Rukuni Wasawasa, below the ocean, there are lots of things that we cannot see. Eh? I did a short video for children a few days ago, just to make them understand and visualize that while we're on the boat, you know, enjoying a kava or playing cards in the wanga, below the boat, these are the things that are under the ocean. So a lot of the parents were messaging me and they were able to show it to their children and they could able to visualize it. And I know that many of our islanders from not only Fiji, but different parts of the Pacific are watching. And these were just some pictures I saw online, Paddy, just for us to be able to visualize. Of course, we cannot go underwater. We can go scuba diving maybe, but this is not the view we can see it. Would you just like to add a few more of your points on these two pictures, Congo, but we can start with this one first.
Start with this one.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I think sometimes because we can't see beneath the ocean surface, we just assume that it's all not very interesting. But you're absolutely right. This is how it looks. And we now have maps of every part of the ocean floor, everywhere in the world. We can actually make some of these maps from satellite. So we can actually create maps of every part of the ocean floor. And it's just as complicated as the land above the ocean. There's lots and lots of hills and valleys, and absolutely right, there's lots of volcanoes. I always say that every island in the Pacific began its life as a small volcano on the floor of the ocean. And that I think is absolutely true. I can't think of an island that didn't. You know, begin its life as a small volcano, growing up slowly from the floor of the ocean, and then eventually breaking the surface of the ocean, growing above the ocean like that. And then, yeah, this is a really good illustration of underwater volcanoes or submarine volcanoes, as they are sometimes called. Perfect. So what you see in the middle slide there is just what I'm talking about. Liquid rock rising up, maybe 3,000 degrees Celsius, meeting cold, icy cold ocean water. And bang, there's a massive eruption. And the rock that's formed breaks up into small particles, fragmented particles. And a lot of that floats away as pumice, soata, as we call it in Fiji. And if the eruption continues for long enough, then eventually when the volcano builds above the ocean surface, lava comes out instead of these fragmented rocks. And that can build an island like Vanuatu, you know, that can last for some time, but they don't always last. That's the thing.
Because I remember Paddy with the two islands in Tonga, the Hunga Hapai and Hunga Tonga. Some of the experts from NASA and from the Smithsonian Museum and from the different organizations, they were surprised that the islands, the new islands that were formed way back in 2009, were able to be above water permanently. To be what we saw for the last couple of years. They were thinking or saying exactly what you were saying, that they will come above and then it will kind of go underwater or disappear. but fascinating again to learn and appreciate the various processes like this. And our Talanoa session today has really made it so clear to many of our listeners. They're just messages of appreciation coming through from our listeners. So for those of you who are watching, if you have any questions at all for Professor Paddy, just message me and I will be happy to connect you with him. And I'm sure similar to the last Talanoa session we had, he was able to communicate with many of you who had so many questions, who have a lot of just curiosity, because this is a field that a few of us are privileged. There's a few listening today who had geography as our major at the university. So this was something that we were studying for 3 to 4 years when we were at USP. So looking at volcanoes and looking at Paddy doing the lecture on the subduction like this.
Tarisi never forgets that.
I will never forget that with the subduction of the plates, the plate tectonics. And so for those of you who took economics, some of you took law, some of you took education, don't worry. You don't feel like you are not included, in this field of study. But that is why Professor Paddy is here with us to make this information more accessible and make us more familiar and be more alert, and maybe, share a lot of this in different types of platform, whether it's schools, if you're a school teacher, those of you who are creating new curriculum, maybe this information needs to go in there so that our younger learners, can be able to be more informed adults in the future. Professor Paddy, any other information that you wanted to share that we have covered?
I don't think so. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Dr. Tarisi, and look, my best wishes to everyone who is listening to this, and please stay safe, look after yourselves, get vaccinated. Kunirere, it's no problem.
Yes,
and loloma to everyone in Tonga.
Vinaka vakalevu Sara Paddy for giving your time so willingly for all of us to have access to your knowledge, also the research that you have done, and you're so positive about it and upbeat about it, that we need to know and be informed that the threats like this is not only just Tonga, not only just the Pacific, it's a global phenomena, and we need to be aware of that. But today's session is more to highlight the knowledge of what is around us due to what has happened in Tonga. Vakalevu Sara Paddy, kita salalom sartiani vale, Verona Vitinani, lolamo to Rosaline and to Petra, and I will be in touch again. Vinaka
Navalevu Tarisi, lolamo verta mai vale. Okay.
Naka, iya.
Nakamasta.
Naka, wadamanda.
Iyo.
Naka. Thank you so much to Professor Paddy Nunn. I know many of you have really appreciated his time. He willingly gave his time based on our request to him to come back. He has been on my program, I think, 3 times already. He's someone that I admire as a teacher. He was my professor at the University of the South Pacific many moons ago, and I know some of you who are listening in today also were his students as well. So mbulu binaka Gina, mbulu binaka Mastele, mbulu binaka mbulu Charlotte na walwalo, mutsa mbulu binaka tau serima mbokini korosaya, ndo mbulu binaka Pauline Turangamberi tukisuba, binaka vakalevu Sara na sema mai, rupeni matolomani, binaka vakalevu na sema mai, Mereseni balele buka o nimbosewanga di nasaranga. So these are some of the slides that I created and have it prepared alongside Paddy. So I've also made some videos, short videos for children on my YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed, please go and subscribe to it. So I'm just creating short videos for children in the Fijian language and also in the English language. I'm also working with my Tongan sister in Sydney, Anna, to translate my videos into Tongan. And I'm also looking at Dr. Mary Sovic from Vanuatu, who's listening in too. Dr. Mary, please, I'll knock on your door for you to translate it into Bislama, if that's possible. So for some of you who are listening in who have other languages that you know, please email me and I will send you the PowerPoint so you can be able to do the voiceover. So we can have as many of these videos widely shared, to different parts of the region or even the world, for our younger listeners. Not only younger ones, but the young at heart as well have messaged me that they've really enjoyed the videos. So tonight I'll do a video on the tsunami and the different types of videos on climate change and all of that. So I hope that you will enjoy it when we put it up on Talanoa with Dr. T. Yeah, so some of you are asking me, where is the YouTube channel? So please go into the YouTube link and type in Talanoa with Dr. T, and you will see some of the videos there. We can also do them in Rotuman. Master Le, yes, it has to be in the Pandava dialect, of course, definitely. I'd love to see that too. And yeah, if anyone wants to collaborate with me to translate these videos into different dialects and languages, I'll be happy to partner with you to get that resources out there for our teachers. Vinaka vakalevu Sara for joining in. For those of you joining in from the Middle East, Bula Vinaka Safaira, Vikimdo Memerika, those of you connecting in from the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and also in Rotuma, in the Cook Islands, all over the world. Vinaka vakalevu. Really, really appreciate you all. And definitely check out my YouTube channel and subscribe. If you don't subscribe, I will hassle you because I can see people's names if you haven't. I will send you the link and please do subscribe. Anyway, tomorrow we are going back to the Vakanrove Talanoa session. Laisa Volokoro, the Fijian Vunde Queen, will be joining us tomorrow. 8 p.m. Fiji time. So please wear your dancing shoes and join us tomorrow. She will be serenading us as well. Yeah, look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Ni mataka. Au sava ko mwadeyani vikemni to vakasara. Enji ni mataiwalu Vinaka vakalevu. Good night, everybody. Makarita eresito. Iyo, singa ni Simba ni mataka. Sponsored by the Vakanrove province. Especially our Wunde Queen from Yavata. So if you're from Yavata, don't miss our Talanoa session tomorrow. So we're going back to our Talanoa program from the Vakanrove. And Saturday, Sunday, we also have special guests that are joining us too. Really appreciate your support and share this video as widely as possible. And yeah, the more information we know about what is around us, the better. Nakavakalevu Tokagusu, Susana, my mainland, thank you so much for joining in. Akanisita Rambe, Nakavakalevu Sarna Sema, my Emily Sangaitu, Naka, Tausangole, Madaman.